Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on the Potomac Watch podcast with Kim Strassel and Colin Levy, also of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. We're talking about the uproar over the testimony by college presidents in Capitol Hill, which has resulted in one resignation so far of the president. May end up with more, as Bill Ackman, the big donor for Harvard, and Alan Dershowitz, the former Harvard law professor, have both called for the resignation of Claudine Gay, the president. Board of Overseers is no doubt considering all of what has happened. But let's talk about the larger context here. And Kim, I want to elaborate a little bit about this view of the oppressor versus the oppressed, the colonizer versus the colonist. I'm old, but I did read my Frantz Fanon in college, The Wretched of the Earth, justifying violence against colonizers and violence against the West. But that was one point of view. Now it is, in fact, as my understanding is, on a lot of campuses, it is the dominant point of view. It is the view that everybody on campus, or most students, are obliged to at least bow to in some way, with the West and, in fact, the United States thought to be founded in a corrupt system rooted in sexism and racism. And the New York Times did this with its 1619 Project. And that seems to be something that is just a very dominant view on campus.
This is why I think this hearing really caused such an explosion. It's because it was a moment, but it was a moment that really put on full display just that entire culture, how anti-American and anti-Western universities have become overall. Because you have to add it to everything else we've been reading about, okay? The backlashes and refusal to have speakers of different viewpoints come onto campus, segregated dormitories, segregated graduations, the lack of due process over the years for men on campus who are accused of anything, intellectual conformity on all of this, the entire institution viewed through race, gender, and sexuality, and those prisms defining every aspect of the college experience, whether or not you are admitted in the beginning, what classes you can take, what speakers who are allowed to come. And the comments by those three presidents, I think, simply was a tipping point. And the good news is we're now seeing a lot of donors and alumni come out and say enough is enough, because it didn't happen for too long. There are ways to affect change and to stop this at these universities, but it's only going to come when the larger community of graduates and people who donate stop worrying so much about whether or not their own kids get in or having their name on a building, but actually using their influence to try to restore a culture of intellectual freedom and debate at these places. So in that regard, I think this moment in Congress was very important. We'd already seen some of it building already, but this is a little bit of a tipping point, I think.
Another factor in, I think, the germination of this kind of culture on campus, Colin, is DEI, also known as diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy. Not everybody would agree that this is the root of it, but I certainly believe it is, in part. We had an op-ed recently about the tenure process at Ohio State University, a public university, based on a Freedom of Information Act request that the writer had made, and discovered the comments that were made during the tenure process. And it became very clear that unless you bowed to the gods of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you had zero chance of getting tenure. You simply had to demonstrate that you agreed, that you believed in the ideology of victims and victimizers, and the victimizers being essentially white and privileged, and the victims being the people who deserved all of the benefit of assistance and racial preferences and so on. It's very clear that this has taken hold and essentially is crucial to tenure decisions on campus.
No, for sure. I mean, the DEI bureaucracy, Paul, has certainly been the largest driver of intellectual conformity on campus. And it's also been building for decades, where the hiring of professors who share the same views, and it all becomes a bit of an ivory tower where everyone believes the same thing that they hear inside the echo chamber. There's no question that dismantling some of those structures will be very important here. And as we've talked about before, it's not just a matter of shutting down voices. That's not the point. The point is getting in more diversity of voices, not just of experiences, but of viewpoints. And that's what we've seen. Schools, we've talked before about the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which is looking at starting a school specifically to bring in more sort of debate and free expression and creating a culture that allows people outside of this general campus progressive mentality to speak their minds without feeling intimidated, because that kind of intimidation can happen in the classroom and in an intellectual context as much as it can happen on the campus quad.
So the question is, what can be done about it? I'm not sure we want the U.S. Congress. In fact, I am sure we don't want the U.S. Congress dictating
Thank you.
anything on campus. But boards of trustees obviously have a crucial role here. They name the president of universities, particularly private universities, but also the chancellors of the University of Wisconsin system, for instance, will pick the head of those different schools, both in Madison and elsewhere. And that's a very important decision because as some presidents have explained to me, they sign off on every faculty tenure decision. So the president of Dartmouth told me recently she gets to sign off on every tenure decision. So it's important who you pick as president. You need somebody who's a president who has enormous guts to be able to stand up to this culture of DEI and of conformity. Second, there's the donors, as Kim mentioned before. And are they willing to withhold money from these institutions in order to say, look, we need to change. You need to change, and we're not going to give unless you do. I think back to Ken Griffin, the Citadel hedge fund manager who gave a donation some months back to Harvard. I think it was $300 million. It was a lot of money. And I remember thinking at the time, and I regret not having written about it at the time, but I remember thinking that really $300 million check without consideration for the way that Harvard has turned on so much of these issues. I wonder what he thinks now. Are those two levers enough to make a difference, Kim?
They're enough if people follow through on them. And I think we're just seeing that right now at Penn. As you mentioned, McGill resigned on management, has really been on a tear. He's the head of the advisory board at the Wharton School at Penn. I think because of his leadership and his activism on this, Ron Lauder, another financier, former Governor Huntsman of Utah, a very wealthy family, they have said that they're pulling back donations. Ross L. Stevens, $100 million withdrawal of his donation, he said, unless changes were made at the school. And that was the sort of thing that finally made the overseers of Penn stand up and pay attention and decide that they needed to do something differently. We're seeing that a little bit, as you noticed, at Harvard. Now Bill Ackman is leading the charge. He recently sent a letter saying that he felt that Claudine Gay had, quote, done more damage to the reputation of Harvard University than any individual in our nearly 500-year history. He's calling on other people to do the same. But a lot of it, Paul, is also going to be follow through. As you note, it's one thing to get the current leadership to resign. But if all that is going to mean is that they're going to put a new person in that's very much the same mindset as the old person, or maybe they try to fix all this by saying, oh, we'll add a class next semester talking about the history of anti-Semitism and add Jews to our list of marginalized people, etc. But they don't go about changing the culture, then this is all just papering over the problem. So I think we have to hope that those who are affecting some change right now are going to stay with it and not just say, once they've got a scalp, that this is over.
Well, on that note, I think we will end this discussion. I think that quasi-hopeful note. We'll see if they follow through. But it certainly has been an illuminating week on this front, and that's all to the good. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope you'll be with us tomorrow as well. Thanks for listening.